Let's talk about mono power amplifiers that are compact and quite small, yet not Class D, but Class AB instead. They're called Topping B200, and as you can see, they're quite compact, even though they're Class AB and they're very powerful, going up to 200 watts. But they can do this because, as you can see in the back, we do not have, these are quite hefty by the way, even though they are small, because most of the device is metal heatsink. But what I was telling you is that in the back you have this power inlet that is connected to the external power supply, external power brick of 64 volts, 4 amperes for each channel. There are 2 of these bricks powering each mono amplifier. Some people don't like this. Some like it because they say this way we keep the power supply noise and electromagnetic interference out of the box where signal is amplified, and that is supposedly technically better and keeps the signal cleaner. Anyways, as you can see, these do not have any volume control knob because these are true power amplifiers. Volume control has to come from preamp or DAC with integrated preamp or anything like that, because these simply provide gain and power, no volume attenuation. By the way, Topping itself mentions that this power amp is based on the same design as LA90 discrete, and it's even slightly improved. But while LA90 was a stereo amplifier that could be used as mono, this is a dedicated mono box, and you can see that in the back, with only 2 binding posts for 1 speaker. There are also 3 analog inputs, 3 different inputs. All of these are balanced, and as you can see, this is a combined port. It can accept XLR and TRS cables. But in the front there's only 1 power button. Okay, this other one is actually connected to the power, so you turn it on, you hear a click, and then you can circle these 3 inputs. Hold it a little bit to power it off, and that's it. Power amps are simple devices like that. One thing that you can control though is in the back here you can see a small switch that says low or high, and that is for gain setting. Low one is 11 point something dB, while the high one is 22 dB. And this is a good thing to have because different preamps or DACs feeding this unit might work better with one or the other gain. In my experience, both worked just fine with all of the equipment I tried these amps with. There's just a slight difference, sonic difference between these 2 gains, but we'll talk about that more. But before that, I just wanted to mention that there is a 12 volts trigger in the back on both of these units, if you want to use it, and some specs. Now, as sheer power go, this is quite a powerful amplifier, going up to 200 watts into 8 ohms, and also staying 200 watts into 4 ohms, and for 2 ohms load it is not specified. And this tells us something, and that is that if you have a really low impedance speakers that can dip to 2 ohms or something like that, these amplifiers are probably not going to be the best solution for you. Because when power is not rising into lower impedance loads, it means that there is like current limit on these, and very low impedance speakers demand very high currents. But other than that, no reason to fear for power. I connected these to several 85 dB speakers that are not easy loads, and these Toppings had plenty of drive and power and control over like bass drivers, even more than I expected actually. Aside from power, all other aspects that one can put in the tech spec sheet or measure, all of those aspects are simply fantastic, like dynamic range or signal to noise ratio, things like that are through the roof, because this is Topping. They excel in doing that. But does that measured excellence translates into high quality sound? Let's find out. The first day I put these into my system, I noticed that the sound can be slightly congested and slightly analytical, but it took only a day or two for these amps to relax and settle into their real sound, which is definitely not that congested or analytical. And these two sound very tonally neutral and very transparent. And I'm not just saying that in terms of like, oh yeah, you have a lot of high frequencies and tiny details are thrown at you and you have the impression of transparent sound by using the trick that high frequencies are simply thrown at you. It's not that. This is a sound that has a truly tremendous amount of low-level details. That means that its background is like vacuum dark. Tones emerge from that darkness. And even when there is like a louder main leading vocal or instruments playing, there's still a sensation of that great background darkness behind those loud leading tones. And those smaller background details are still very clearly observable and not muddied or concealed in any way by those bigger tones. Now, talking about low-level detailing, part of that is tone decay and tone trails, however you want to call that. For example, if you take an acoustic guitar and you pluck a string and there's that initial leading edge and like details of string vibrating and everything, but then there is a slow tone decay and resonating of the guitar body and of the wire, and when recorded well, you can hear both in low frequencies, like longer bass tone decay, but also in the higher frequencies, higher pitched tone decay. And with really great devices, even when another tone starts, like another string, another much more louder and more prominent tone emerges, you can still hear tone decay from the last one. And one of my friends called that kind of sound tone that never dies. And I have to be honest that up until now I've heard it in some Class A amplifiers, like Pass Labs amplifiers for example, and also in some latest generation Purify amplifiers. And now with these toppings too. And many analytical sounding pieces of gear in hi-fi cannot do that. Even though they can show great amount of details, like edges and high frequencies and tiny things, it feels like they are suffocating the tone sooner than it is realistic. And that's something that doesn't happen with these topping amps. And I was honestly afraid that it would be like a dryish analytical sound, but it's not. That ability joined with this really squeaky clean and dark background creates also fantastic sound staging, because all kinds of echoes in the recording or simply artificially added reverbs to simulate like big rooms or smaller rooms or whatever sound an engineer wanted really, all of these are very obvious with Topping B200s. And I have a feeling of really three-dimensional, deep soundstage with fantastic layering and fantastic pinpointing of the instruments. Soundstage is both wide and really deep. And even in more complex tracks, when there are more than like 2, 3, 4 instruments, organization of all of that and separation and the sensation of empty space around instruments is still great. And I just realized that I didn't actually talk about tonality at all. And tonality is mostly really neutral as it gets. But this doesn't mean that it's flat or boring in any way. For example, bassline has a real grunt and heft to it. And that's something that I truly didn't expect. I expected them to be a little bit challenged and limited when it comes to dynamics, because most of topping amps, at least Class D amps that I reviewed so far, they had a bit of that problem. Touch of leanness and lack of grunt and authority of bigger amps. I did not notice that here. Bassline is full, it has really good depth, really good volume, and it's also well controlled. There's authority there. In songs, for example, like this one, when there's great amount of bass, that doesn't make amps lose control, muddy the mid-range, collapse the soundstage, or anything like that. And that can often happen with amps that lack a bit of power, that lack a bit of current output, and they can sound fantastic with really simple few instrument songs, but when things get tough, they get stressed. And they start to muddy things and collapse instruments into each other. B200s don't do that. Soundstage stays big, wide, deep, and everything stays well layered and well pinpointed in all tracks that I've tested them with. And finally, dynamics. This is interesting part because this is the amp that is not too forward sounding. Especially somewhere in the mid-range, there is actually a sensation of these toppings being somewhat laid back. But for example, the bass line has great authority and very good punch. Highest frequencies are really well extended. They have great presence, things like cymbals, triangle, all kind of bells. They have fantastic energy and great like zing to them. They sound radiant, they have good tone decay, but the mid-range itself, while superbly clean and informative, is not forward. It does not give the kind of presence and attack that some of you would like. Instead, it has that like Hegel kind of tuning where it's squeaky clean, precise, truly revealing and transparent, but it has that deeper, more laid back sensation, whereas everything is arranged from your speakers and back. It can go far back depending on the recording, but if you want something that is really forward, it doesn't really do that in-your-face kind of sound. Other than that, the overall dynamics and dynamic swings are really great and I have no complaints about it. Which leads me to comparisons. Now first, I know that many of you would ask how it compares to Fosi V3 Mono, even though the pricing is quite different. And I'll say this immediately without being here too much. B200 is considerably better sounding than Fosi V3 Mono. It feels more powerful. There is much better bass authority and grunt, and the overall clarity is also better. The soundstage is wider, deeper, just more spacious overall, and the pinpointing is better. Moving to Topping PA7 that I mentioned is slightly better than Fosi V3 Monos. This one goes for $550 I believe, and it's a small Class D amp, also with external brick, but this is a stereo amp, so one box, one external power supply. And this one also has similar tonality and just great transparency and clarity. The difference is that PA7 Plus does not have the equal amount of authority and grunt that B200s have. There is kind of leanness in the bass line with PA7 Plus, and there's a slight dynamic flatness. While it's super clean and crisp and just transparent sounding, dynamic swings is something that feels slightly compressed. And when you add that leaner bass line, it's overall speaking a leaner sounding amp that doesn't feel as powerful as B200s, even though on paper I believe they have similar kind of powers. In reality though, B200s feel more powerful, they have better drive and more authority. Also the overall amount of tiny low-level details is better with B200, and the soundstage is even wider and even deeper. This led me to my next comparison with Acoustic Invader amplifier. This is based on the IcePower 1200 AS2. and this one is 1500 euros. I have two of these. I use them as dual mono setup. And when I compared Toppings directly to these, Toppings finally met their match in terms of how big soundstage these IcePower amps can create, and also great dynamics and authoritative sound, authoritative bassline. But I have to say that Toppings here sound even more transparent. If you're hunting details, you will dig more details through Toppings than you would with these two IcePower amps. Bassline feels fuller and like it has more volume with Toppings, where it is speedier but cleaner with IcePowers. In the highest registers, IcePowers feel slightly tamer and darker, whereas Toppings have more extension and more of that high frequency radiance. Aside from that, throughout the mid-range, there is a tonal difference where IcePowers have warmer character overall. Tones appear to be thicker and warmer, but also less defined and less resolving than Topping, that has a sort of brutal transparency that I think puts your source and your preamp more on the spot than IcePower does. And in Samsung, I found that Acoustic Invaders, IcePower amps, create a more pleasant tonality that feels more chocolatey and also feels more textured, like there's a richer tone timbre. And when I move to Topping, I find the same songs to sound a bit leaner in the mid-range, but when I focus, I actually realize that Toppings are digging out more of that low-level detailing. And also, tone decays and tone trails last longer in time, and the background behind the instruments is darker, and soundstage appears to be deeper, and tones inside of it better pinpointed. Everything sounds a bit thicker and warmer with Acoustic Invader IcePowers, but it's also a bit more diffused and fuzzier around the edges, and with a touch of grain in tone, which often appears to be like a natural texture of the tone. And because of that, I think that most listeners would say that tone timbre is better with Acoustic Invaders. But with that, as I said, tones are slightly less defined, and they are slightly hazier, and they do conceal tone details and spatial cues more than Toppings. So I think in this case it's choosing between something that's more brutally neutral and honest and even more revealing, and something that is a bit more concealing, wrapped in a bit of warmth, colored in a really nice way, but ultimately less revealing. And why I have to say that subjectively it's really difficult to me to say that Toppings are better, because I'm living with these Acoustic Invader IcePower amps for quite some time now, and my ear and my brain are adjusted to them. Also, by the way, the rest of the system is fine-tuned to match very nicely with these amps. But I have to say that objectively, Toppings do sound more neutral. They let low-level details pass through more easily, and the soundstage feels deeper, and pinpointing is better. And when you count in the price, those are really something. But this leads me to one more topic before we end this video, and that's pairing. Having amps that are brutally transparent like this is not always going to be a blessing. If you hook them to the mid-range DAC and use that DAC for volume attenuation, skipping preamp altogether, that DAC acting as a preamp will probably, most probably, sound slightly analytical and thin and, spatially speaking, congested. And these amps will not do a single thing to help that sound. They'll just pass it through to your speakers, and the sound will be thin, analytical, and like dynamically flat. I cannot enjoy that. some lesser amp with more color, with more grit even, with less defined bass and more grain that is coloring the sound in a way to appear more textured would sound better with that sort of DAC acting as a preamp. But if I take a really good source in the DAC, like SMSL SU10 for example, or Gustard R26, or any good DAC, my own tube DAC, or a live harmony DAC even, and then I take a really good preamp, like Lederbach, or Schizfreya Plus for example, with really good tubes, or my own acoustic invader Fulcrum, which is like 6,000 euros preamp, and that combination of a DAC and the preamp creates full, lush sound that has great soundstage, deep and wide space and rich tone timbre that just passes through these amps, and they sound like that. So the trap is that they're just very revealing and very transparent, and they will be equally happy to expose faults in the devices before them as they will be with passing through fantastic, full, lush, natural sound of really great hi-fi devices if you have those in your system. So have that in mind. Transparency is not something that is always desired. Even though we think it is, sometimes it's really not. Oh, I had to turn on my camera again because I forgot to say something that I should probably not be saying. It's one of these snake oil and welcome to the dark side of the audiophile world advice, but it doesn't take any money. These are, at least in my experience, sensitive to how you connect them in your mains socket. Take both of these amps, take the power cables, and try one position, then switch one, turn it around, try the other position. That way you basically change live and neutral. And most devices have one position that sounds slightly better than the other. So in the worst case scenario, these two will sound slightly thinner and slightly more analytical, but when you find the correct position for both, they will actually sound a bit fuller, and tone decay will be more natural and healthier, and the soundstage more three-dimensional. The effect is subtle, but in a really good system it's noticeable and it's free, so try it. Another thing that I forgot is gains. Lower gain to my ears sound even more brutally transparent and completely neutral, while higher gain adds a little bit of bass and mid-bass warmth, and it wraps tones in a bit of that mid-bass padding, but it does make highs slightly less radiant and the overall soundstage depth slightly less deep. It's a very subtle difference. I did prefer low gain, but if you have any problem with your system where it maybe sounds touch lean or analytical or anything like that, you actually might prefer higher gain. So once again, try it for yourself. And guys, I think that I'm actually going to keep using these in my own system, my main system, and that I listen to every day. They're that good. And with that, it's time to end this review. I hope you liked it. See you next time.